Hey guys, this is Michael from SYE, and I'm going to give you a mini lesson today on the verbs and grammar of stories, narratives, and anecdotes. So most of you probably don't know this, but I actually grew up just a little bit outside of Washington, D.C., maybe about 2 hours or so. And on the weekends, because there was nothing to do where I lived, we would try to drive down to Washington, D.C. and go to clubs and listen to great bands and good music. One night we were at a club and the band finished a song and all of a sudden we heard this loud pop and all of the electricity went out. And then the lights inside came back on, but the band had nothing to play with. All their electricity was gone. And so at first we just sort of stood and looked around, and then you could feel this kind of murmur building up as people were getting impatient. And then all of a sudden everybody just started yelling and shouting because they were so upset. But then the drummer of the band, through all of this noise, you could just hear her voice say, "Hey, did you guys ever hear the one about the Pope and his car breaking down in New York City?" And then everybody stopped, and we all looked at her, wondering what she was going to say. And she said, "Yeah, so this one time, the Pope was visiting New York City, and he was driving along, and his car broke down. So he had to try to figure out a way to get to where he was going. And all the security guards and all the people, they're running around trying to figure out what to do. And the Pope says, you know what? I know what I'll do. I'm going to go and get a taxi, and I'll ride the rest of the way, and that'll be the end of it." So he goes, and he hails for a taxi, and the taxi stops, and the cab driver looks at him, and he says, "Your Holiness, I am a Catholic. If I take you in this car and we get into a car accident, then that sin will be on me, my family, and my children for the rest of our lives. I cannot in good conscience let you be in this car with me driving." And the Pope said, "No, it's okay. You scoot over, you can sit in the passenger side, and I will drive us the rest of the way." And the man says, "Okay." So the Pope gets into the car and they start driving along. And then, because it's New York City, and everything in New York has to involve the police, they drive maybe 10 minutes, and all of a sudden a cop car comes out, pulls them over, and they're sitting there waiting. So the cop comes over, the Pope rolls the window down, and the cop looks in, he looks at the Pope, and then he looks at the man sitting next to the Pope, and he says, "Excuse me, 1 second." And he turns around and he goes back to his police car, and he gets onto his radio and he says, "Hey, I don't know what to do, but I just pulled over somebody who's really important, and I don't know if I should let him go or give him a ticket." And the person on the other end said, "Well, what's the problem? How important are they? Are they like the mayor of New York City?" And he says, no, it's much bigger than that." And he says, "So what, like the governor of the state of New York?" And he says, no, bigger than that." And he says, "What, is it like the president?" And he said, "I don't know who he is, but the Pope's driving him." And then the drummer hit the drums with the cymbal, and then the show kept on going. So you may not think of it, but most of the time, if you're telling a story, a joke, or any kind of experience from your past, you're going to end up structuring it with language. So it's very important that you try to understand certain things that you need to be using while you're telling these stories. And that's what I want to talk with you about today. So I am going to give you 3 basic categories for looking at these kinds of stories. So the first one is rhetorical questions. After that are modal verbs. And the last one is going to be American slang. Okay. So what do I mean by these? So the first is think about rhetorical questions. When I told the story, did you happen to notice what the drummer said? So she began her joke by saying, "Hey, did you ever hear the one about the Pope and his car breaking down in New York City?" So this is a rhetorical question that she's asking not so much for people to answer her, but just to let everyone know she's about to tell a joke. And so what she says is, "Did you hear the one?" But to make it a little bit more slang and make it more feel like it's good American English, instead of saying, did you hear, it's better to say, did ya? Did you hear the one? Did you understand that? Did you know what I meant? Things like that. Did ya is a contraction that is mainly used in very, very, very slang English language and very, very normal street talk. So these are very good ways to start with all of these kinds of stories. But rhetorical questions can go further than just starting. They also are great ways to bridge your story as you're moving along, and also to check in with the audience as they're listening to what you're saying. So it's very common, as an example, to say something like, you know what I mean? So you're going through a whole part of a story, and then you pause for a second and say, hey, you know what I mean? And you just wait and see them say, and then you know that they understand and they're following you. So, do you know what I mean? And of course, there are hundreds of variations on this phrase. So, do you know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? You know what it's about? You know what's going down? Anything like that. And it's important to do this because you don't want to lose them. You don't want them to feel like you're just ranting about something. You're just telling something out of nowhere. You want to make sure that you're with your audience on all of these kinds of things. So I want to take a break from this and move over to the modal verbs. So the main modal verbs of stories are could, would, and should. And these are so common that they have their own slang term that goes along with them. So if you are telling a story, most of the time you are looking back on something that happened in your life and you're thinking about how it could have been different. This is what we all do. We all talk about what would life be like if I took that test different, if I got that job, if I did this, if I did that, if this didn't happen, but this happened, anything like that. So we always will use within our stories, I could have done this, I should have done that, or if things were different, I would have done that. And as I said, these are so normal that people will just say, you know what, man, coulda, shoulda, woulda. So you talk about the things in your life that you complain about, the things that you don't want to deal with, and then someone will just tell you, hey man, coulda, woulda, shoulda. So there are other things that you need to consider though when you're telling a story. And one of the hardest things I think for most English language learners is that they become very accustomed to, they become very used to using very simple verbal phrases. So one of the most common verbs that you will be using within a story is going to be said or say. The policeman said, the Pope said. This is all how we talk. So there are lots of other ways that you can express what's happening in a story that moves beyond just he said, she said. So the first one is just a simple synonym, which is he goes. So I saw this guy in the street and he goes, hey man, what's up? That's it. He said, he goes. It's an easy way to start to break away from said, to try different kinds of things. Another really common phrase is he's like, or he's all like. Basically, they mean the same thing, but if you say he's all like, usually that is more like a stronger way of saying it. You're adding extra emphasis to it. But the point is that he's like is something more than just he said. If you're going to say he's like, then you're going to build in some sort of interpretation. You're going to imitate whoever it was that said something. And that's going to be important because you can add descriptions without actually having to use words. You have a police officer and you can say, the policeman said, get out of your car. So that makes sense. But I could also say, the policeman came over and he was like, hey man, get out of the car. And so by changing the way that I say it, I can imply that the police officer was being really aggressive. But you can do it in different ways, because I could also say, the police guy came over and he was like, oh, get out of your car. And it just means that I think he's an idiot. Now, another thing to consider is that when you tell a story, often you're sticking to a specific genre of story. So for instance, when I started, I told a story that had a joke in the middle of it. And I used very specific kinds of questions and terms that fit with a very funny story. So you have to make sure that you're using your stories very carefully and that you're adding things to let everyone know what your story is going to be about. So again, for instance, if I tell you a scary story about something that happened to me, I'm probably going to make sure right away that I'm letting you know it's going to be a scary story. So usually we'll start off a scary story by saying something like, this really terrible thing happened to me when I was a child, or this really awful thing, or this really terrifying thing. Any kind of adjective like that. And these are important ways to let everyone know how this is going to go, how long your story is, where it begins, where it ends, anything like that. So I want you to pay attention to those points, how we work these different genres, how we use sentences to describe the beginning and ending of different kinds of stories. So when I was a little kid, the freakiest and scariest thing happened to me. My family has moved around different parts of America for all of my life. I've lived in a bunch of different states, and I've had to live in different cities and meet with different kinds of people. This has just become very normal for me. But when I was about 7, my family moved into this small house that was kind of a ways back into the forest. And I know this sounds like a cliche setup for some sort of a scary story, but this really is what happened. So one day, I was walking up the stairs of our house, and I could feel this sensation on one of the boards, on one of the steps. And it was like, in English we say pins and needles. I think in Arabic you talk more about ants crawling on your skin, and this is what it felt like. Just suddenly, all on my foot, I could feel this thing. And I just went about my business because, again, I was like 7 years old, so you don't even really think about these things. But as time went on, day after day, year after year, I could still feel this thing in this spot. And then one day, I would walk down the stairs and I tripped. And I fell the rest of the way down the stairs and I broke my leg. And it was still this same step that I was touching. And so I had complained about this to my parents over and over and over since I was a little kid. But now I was like 16, and this weird feeling and this thing, and now me falling down the stairs, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to find a way to figure out what was happening. So thankfully my father believed me. I think that me falling down the stairs, it took that moment for him to really believe that something was happening. And in America, you're allowed to do what's called a Freedom of Information Act, which is you can request any kind of information about an area. And he was able to get records on this house. And we found out that a woman had died in the house. She had lived in there for all of her life, and one day she fell down the stairs, and we found in the police reports that she died on the step that I had this weird feeling. So what was she doing? I don't know. Is she trying to get me? Is she trying to tell me something? There's no way that I can really understand or try to handle this in my daily life, but it's always there in my mind that this crazy old lady is probably the one who tried to push me down the stairs so that I would die like she did. So did you understand the story? You understand what happened to me? But more importantly, did you hear any of these things? Did you hear me saying could, should, or would? Did you hear me using any of these kinds of verbs? Or any of these slang terms? Or any of these rhetorical questions? If you heard something, let me know. Try to put something down in the comments so that I can see. And then, okay, I hope you guys enjoyed my mini lesson. We'll be offering more of these, so please come back and have fun learning with us. Thanks.